All right, let's dive right into this. You've gathered this really amazing collection of sources looking at how ideas about gender expression have evolved over time, like spanning from ancient Egypt all the way to the early 1900s. And we're talking about everything from androgyny and cross-dressing to the very beginnings of those early gay communities. So in this deep dive, I think our mission is to really dig into these sources, find those hidden gems, those surprising insights into how different societies have viewed and even interacted with what we might now consider transgender identities and behaviors. It's like a journey through time, to understand how power dynamics, religion, and those social norms have all played a role in shaping these perceptions.
It's really amazing the range of material we have to work with here. It's not just a surface level look. We've got, these in-depth academic studies on ancient Egypt, the complexities of gender in Greek theater, and then even these glimpses into the lives of people in those very early LGBTQ plus communities in Europe and America. It's not just a timeline of events. It's about really understanding the motivations, the cultural context that inform these historical accounts and connecting them to the bigger questions of identity and how societies are structured. And this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start at the very beginning with ancient Egypt. One thing that really struck me was how androgyny wasn't some fringe idea. It was actually deeply connected to their understanding of the divine and creation. Like both masculine and feminine aspects were seen as completely essential.
That's right. The sources we have really highlight that in ancient Egyptian thought, both masculinity and femininity were considered these essential forces, especially when it came to the act of creation itself. And the pharaohs, being those crucial links between the human and the divine, would sometimes wear clothing associated with the opposite gender. It was like a symbolic way to really emphasize their power, right? It's like they were saying, I embody both sides of this divine authority. It suggests that society valued not just strict gender roles, but a more complete and powerful form of leadership, reflecting a deeper understanding of these complementary forces at play in the universe.
Right, like they were visually communicating, hey, I've got the full range of divine capabilities here. But even with this important concept of androgyny, the sources also show us that the Egyptian view of gender in daily life remained pretty much binary. There's not a lot of evidence to suggest they widely recognized a third gender.
Yeah, that's a key point. Androgyny held this kind of elevated divine significance. But the way society was structured, the evidence we have, it all points towards a more binary understanding of male and female in everyday life. However, what's really interesting is how the Egyptian beliefs about the afterlife involve this complex relationship with gender.
Oh yeah, this part about needing to embody a male divinity while also possessing female powers, that was a really mind-bending concept when I first read about it. Can you break it down for us? Why was this symbolic shift in gender so important for the afterlife? What were the specific beliefs behind that?
Yeah, it's a pretty intricate system of beliefs they had. The general understanding was that male deities had the exclusive power of creation and resurrection, whereas goddesses were seen more as these protective figures. So, for an Egyptian to reach the afterlife, a deceased man needed to tap into those female powers to essentially give birth to his resurrected self. And a deceased woman, on the other hand, she needed to embody male virility to make sure she could be reincarnated, something that goddesses weren't thought to have. This is why women had to go through this symbolic gender shift before death, adopting male attributes to basically present a male image in the afterlife.
Wow, so it wasn't about changing their actual gender identity, but more like a necessary transformation specifically for that journey to the afterlife. And then there's the instances of cross-dressing, which don't seem to have been super common, but they seem connected to this idea of divine power or roles.
Exactly. The sources suggest that when cross-dressing did happen, it was mainly associated with those figures thought to have a divine nature, like deities themselves or those powerful female pharaohs. And in these cases, wearing clothes usually associated with the opposite gender had a very specific symbolic purpose. It was about showing a certain power or status that the wearer held.
And Hatchepsut, that amazing female pharaoh who ruled for 22 years, she's a great example of this. She's often shown as a male king in those traditional kilts, striding forward like a powerful ruler. It wasn't about trying to trick anyone about her sex, but it was more about embodying that power of the royal office.
That's a crucial distinction. It wasn't about erasing her female identity, which, by the way, was still very clearly acknowledged in the hieroglyphs, that ancient Egyptian writing system.
Yeah.
Even when Hatshepsut is shown as male, you'll see these inscriptions using the feminine forms of her royal names and titles. So it's not about hiding her female identity, but about using that male representation to show her strength as a pharaoh. And actually, scholars think this was a way for her to claim that divine androgyny, having both male and female aspects, to better connect with the gods and maybe legitimize her rule in what was traditionally a male role.
Yeah, it's really fascinating how those ideas about clothing and symbolism still resonate with us today. And then we have the male dwarf god Bes, who's often shown in that very typically female act of nursing. It's another example of a male figure being shown with feminine qualities.
Right, Bes, being the protector of pregnant women and infants, represents this really interesting blend of the masculine and feminine within the divine. It shows us that gender representation in ancient Egypt was actually quite complex, going beyond just powerful human figures like Hatchepsut. Now, moving on from ancient Egypt, we get to ancient Greece, where we see a totally different cultural approach to gender expression.
Yeah, definitely a different scene. And here, the sources emphasize that transvestism had a significant role in both rituals and the theater. Let's start with the theater. It's so interesting how in Athenian plays, all the roles, even the female ones, were played by men because women weren't allowed to perform on stage. I bet that led to some really interesting and maybe even exaggerated forms of gender impersonation.
Absolutely. It's like because their goal was to convincingly portray these female characters to the audience, the male actors would often exaggerate both masculine and feminine physical traits. Imagine men wearing padding to represent female bodies and using specific vocal techniques, gestures, and movements. It was this whole visual and auditory spectacle of gender, all for the sake of entertainment. And what's really fascinating is that this ancient Greek theater actually has its roots in the worship of Dionysus.
Dionysus, the god of fertility and wine. And get this, it was originally women who led these festival rites in his honor. But then, as those evolved into formal theater, women were suddenly barred from performing. That's a huge shift in the gender dynamics of these rituals.
It is quite a significant change. And Dionysus himself, he presents a really interesting case when we talk about gender. He was often depicted wearing these long flowing garments, chitons and humakarians, which were typically considered female attire. But at the same time, he's shown with his undeniably male full beard, at least up until the 5th century BCE. So even the god associated with the very origins of theater had this kind of ambiguous, fluid gender presentation. And his marriage to Ariadne, it's often described as this uniquely harmonious union, maybe hinting at a cultural sensitivity towards these blurred gender lines, at least in certain contexts.
It's like his own fluid presentation allowed for a more balanced dynamic, even among the gods. And speaking of blurred lines, by the late 5th century BCE, the Dionysian cult started to incorporate elements of cross-dressing into its rituals. It seems really tied to this idea of temporarily turning those normal gender roles upside down within the context of those Dionysian mysteries.
Exactly. You know, those Dionysian mysteries, with their ecstatic dance and ritualistic wine drinking, it was all about achieving a state of connection with the god. And cross-dressing was a part of that, letting people shed their typical gender roles and enter into this altered state, maybe seen as closer to the divine or outside the rules of everyday life. And then there's that Oskophoria festival, where 2 young noblemen would dress as women and carry vine branches in a procession. It sounds like a very specific and formalized way of incorporating cross-dressing into a ritual.
Oh yeah. The Oskophoria was a major celebration for Dionysus, and part of that was this very deliberate, symbolic act of having these 2 young men, chosen from important families, dress as women and carry these branches. And to make things even more interesting, women also took part in the festival, playing the roles of the young men's mothers. It really highlights how male and female roles were intertwined in these traditions. Now, as we shift into the medieval period with the rise of Christianity, things change quite a bit when it comes to how gender expression was viewed. They really do. It seems like the Catholic Church, aligned with the ruling class, really cracked down on any kind of expression that they saw as a threat to their authority. And this included a lot of those ritualistic and festival forms of transgender expression that we've been talking about.
You know, the church was this rising institution trying to solidify its power and establish a unified social and political system across Europe. They had a lot at stake. They owned a lot of land, and keeping the existing feudal hierarchy, with all its inequalities, was key to their economic interests and stability. Anything that seemed to challenge those norms, those expressions of gender fluidity you'd often find in peasant festivals and older traditions, it was all seen as a threat, and they went after it.
And they were pretty clear about it too. That Council of Constantinople in 691 CE, a big gathering of church leaders, they explicitly banned those dances and initiation rites associated with what they called pagan gods. And they even said men shouldn't wear women's clothes and vice versa. They basically framed it as going against the Christian way of life.
That's right. The church really went out of its way to demonize cross-gender expression, connecting it with witchcraft and paganism, and they did everything they could to stamp it out of those peasant rituals and celebrations. This condemnation started early on with figures like Caesarius of Arles back in the 6th century denouncing these practices. And this attitude just kept getting reinforced over and over again in church councils and those Christian guidebooks that outline the penances for these behaviors.
But here's where it gets really interesting and kind of hypocritical, The church, while it was so busy condemning this cross-gender behavior in the general population, it actually canonized like 20 to 25 female saints who, according to the stories, cross-dressed, lived as men, or even, some say, miraculously grew beards. That's a pretty big contradiction, right?
It definitely is. And it shows how the church, while strict about gender roles in society, was willing to make exceptions for those seen as super holy. It's like religious devotion, in some cases, could actually override those social norms. But this was very selective, of course. So we have these female-to-male saints like Pelagia, Marinus, or Marina, and there are even legends about a female Pope Joan. These figures lived their lives as men, often in monasteries or other religious settings, and their sex assigned at birth was only revealed after they died. And then there's Wilgefortis, who was made a saint even though she was depicted with a beard, which was supposedly a miracle to help her avoid a forced marriage.
So what's the explanation for this? How could the church accept and even venerate these female-to-male saints when cross-dressing was otherwise condemned? The sources suggest that it might have something to do with their desire for the higher social standing that men had in that feudal society.
That's a big part of it, according to historians. While the church saw most female-to-male expression as this transgression, these saints were admired for what was seen as rising above those limitations placed on women. By taking on a male identity, maybe to escape unwanted marriage or to pursue a religious life not open to women, they gained access to roles and status that were totally off-limits otherwise. But the sources also show that these saints often paid a price. They had to keep their assigned sex a secret their whole lives. It's this early concept of passing. And what's really interesting is that we don't really see any Christian male-to-female saints during this time.
That absence is really telling, right? It shows just how much male-to-female transgender expression and cross-dressing were stigmatized by the church. They saw it as witchcraft, as something evil. The only exception was during those temporary periods of relaxed social rules like carnivals and festivals.
Right. The church was very much against any male-to-female expression, but these kinds of gender nonconformity were still a part of many traditional peasant festivals and celebrations. You can even see this in the roots of Halloween, which comes from some of those older, maybe more gender egalitarian cultures. But the church, in trying to control those popular traditions, wasn't above using some of these practices for its own purposes.
You're talking about how male actors in church-sanctioned plays and religious dramas were allowed, even expected, to wear women's clothes to play female roles. It's strange how they condemned male femininity in everyday life, but exploited it for their own theatrical productions.
Yeah, it's a real contradiction. Some historians even think that this might have come from the traditions of transgender priestesses in those older goddess religions. It's like a subtle form of taking and reinterpreting someone else's culture. But over time, this use of transgender expression in church plays actually led to it being used more for comedy and satire. Some scholars say it actually dispiritualized religious drama. So by the 10th century, you have the church incorporating those transgender elements from those older festivals into its own rituals, but in a very controlled way.
And then we have a much darker side to this period. The Inquisition, starting in 1233, and the witch trials that followed. It wasn't just about enforcing religious beliefs, it was also about keeping that feudal social order in place. And people who didn't fit those strict gender norms, including transgender people, were often targeted.
Absolutely. The Inquisition and the witch hunts were basically tools of terror used to enforce religious doctrine, but also to maintain these social and economic power structures of the time. If you challenged the feudal order, including its strict gender roles, you could become a target. Some accusations against those labeled as witches even claimed they could change sex, which shows you how much fear and misunderstanding there was around gender diversity. And the push to strengthen that system of patriarchal inheritance made things even worse, leading to a crackdown on intersex people and anyone who blurred those rigid gender lines.
It's a really sobering reminder of how those in power will use any means necessary to oppress and demonize those who don't fit their narrow categories. Now, moving into the early modern period, the time of Shakespeare, we start to see more visible, though often still hidden, expressions of gender diversity popping up across Europe.
Yeah, the historical records from this time start to point towards what seems to have been pretty widespread transgender gatherings throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. We have reports of these elaborate drag balls happening in Lisbon, organized groups of male crossdressers in France, even using female names among themselves, and instances in the Dutch Republic of transgender men referring to each other with female nicknames. It suggests that there were more of these communities than we might think.
That's amazing. It shows how these communities were finding ways to connect and express themselves, even if they had to be careful because of social attitudes and laws. And as we get into the 19th century, we have even more detailed examples, like that police raid in England in 1813, where they found people in a pub using female names and wearing women's clothing. Some reports even say the police were fooled by their appearance.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's a description of a trans ball in Paris in 1864 with something like 150 men, some so well disguised that even the owner of the place couldn't tell their assigned sex. This shows how established and sophisticated these communities were, even though they had to operate in secret. But this period also saw more persecution, especially with the arrest of those theater performers, Ernest Bolton and Frederick Park. They used the stage names Stella and Fanny back in 1890.
That case was a turning point, right? They were arrested for conspiracy to commit a felony, which was this vague charge just because they were cross-dressing and associated with other men who did the same. Even though Bolton's mom testified that he had been dressing as a girl since he was 6, the legal system at the time was determined to link cross-dressing with homosexuality, seeing both as criminal.
It really exposes the anxieties people had about gender norms and how those in power would try to control any deviation from those norms. Bolton and Park were eventually acquitted after a big public trial, but their arrest and the whole legal process was a preview of the even worse persecution that would come later for people who challenged gender conventions, like we all know the famous case of Oscar Wilde. And even into the 20th century, prosecutors often just assumed that any man presenting in a feminine way must be gay.
And this wasn't just in England, right? We see 19th century European cities making laws specifically against cross-dressing in public, which led to the arrest of both men and women. Even popular drag performers, who are often celebrated on stage, could get arrested for simply wearing the wrong clothes off stage. Bolton and Park's case really highlights that double standard.
Absolutely. They could be stars on stage, but then face arrest for wearing the same clothes in their personal lives. It's a really precarious position to be in. But then, around the turn of the 20th century, there was this German physician who studied male actors who performed in drag, and he observed that not all men who cross-dress are gay. This was a big deal because it started to challenge that assumption that gender expression and sexual orientation were always linked.
That's an important distinction, recognizing those are separate things. And that kind of leads us into the Prohibition era in the US, which, interestingly enough, is when we see this blossoming of gay nightlife and community formation, according to the sources. We tend to think of Stonewall in 1969 as the start of the gay liberation movement, but it turns out there was this earlier wave that began in Germany back in 1869, and it lasted until 1935, becoming this international movement.
That's a really important historical point. That first wave in Germany was a big deal. It went beyond just LGBTQ plus rights and had a real impact on different areas of society. And during Prohibition in the US, when alcohol was illegal, gay men found some degree of safety and community in those underground speakeasies and nightclubs, especially in cities like New York. It's interesting how even times of restriction can create these spaces for marginalized communities to thrive, those places overlooked by the mainstream.
It's kind of ironic how Prohibition, which was supposed to be this crackdown, unintentionally created this space for those gay communities to grow. They were seeking refuge and belonging in these secret urban environments. And the sources also talk about how between the 1920s and 1930s, there was a wave of gay men and women migrating to cities that already had established gay communities. This often happened through these informal chain migration networks.
Yeah, it's similar to how other groups of migrants would rely on their networks. Those gay individuals used those connections, often through friends and acquaintances, to find places to live, jobs, and, maybe most importantly, those safer and more accepting environments where they could be themselves, even with the homophobia and the laws against homosexuality at the time. And presenting yourself as straight to avoid trouble became a really important survival strategy.
It must have been so emotionally draining to always have to navigate those multiple identities to keep your true self hidden. But the sources suggest that passing became almost second nature for many gay men at that time.
Yeah, it was a necessity because of all the homophobia. Staying hidden, managing those different public and private identities, it was how they survived. But within their own communities, gay men built these extensive social networks based on their shared experiences. These networks provided practical support, like finding housing and work, but also emotional support and that sense of belonging in a world that was often hostile.
And it wasn't just about those support networks, was it? They created their own institutions and rituals, like those parties and gatherings, which were so important for building a shared identity. It's kind of similar to how immigrant groups created their own ethnic theaters or community centers. That story from 1922 about that young gay man imprisoned in New York really paints a vivid picture. It talks about those well-known meeting places for gay people and this whole vibrant social network that included both gay men and women.
Yeah, his story is really powerful. He talks about regularly visiting those restaurants, bars, and clubs that were known within the community as places where gay people would gather. It really shows how visible, yet still discreet, those spaces were. And the fact that lesbians were part of those circles too is significant. It tells us about the connections within those early LGBTQ plus communities.
And it wasn't just about meeting in secret, was it? They were creating a culture, making those parties and gatherings central to their social lives. It was how they met other people, formed relationships, and strengthened those community bonds.
Exactly. Those parties weren't just casual. They were vital for building and sustaining those early gay communities. They provided a sense of identity and support that was so lacking in the outside world.
So, looking back at all of this history, what does it tell us? It's clear that expressions of gender diversity have this long, complicated history, showing up in different ways and carrying different meanings depending on the culture and the time period.
And what's really fascinating is that even across these vastly different times and places, we see similar patterns emerging, from the androgyny of the Egyptian pharaohs to cross-dressing in ancient Greek rituals, the church's mixed messages, and those secret communities forming in the face of persecution in the early 20th century. There's this constant interplay between personal identity, societal norms, and how power dynamics influence everything.
You know, it makes me think about the contradictions we see in those sources, like how the church condemned cross-dressing, yet made saints out of people who did it. And then there's that constant pressure on LGBTQ plus people to pass as straight. It really makes you think about the impact of those mixed messages and how resilient those individuals were, whether they chose to conform or defy those norms. What stands out to you as the most compelling or maybe even the most surprising thing we've uncovered in this deep dive?
You know, what really strikes me is this idea of passing. We've seen it in those early 20th century gay communities, but it was there centuries earlier with those female-to-male saints. I wonder what we would discover if we really dug deeper into the history of passing, how it was used in different times and places. It could give us an even better understanding of how people throughout history have navigated those restrictive, often dangerous social roles around gender. It's something to really think about.